I just want to thank all those who made the webinar possible. There's a lot of work that goes into making something like this happen. And the speakers you have today have a lot of information to offer, and I'm really honored to be asked to be part of this presentation. As Nikki said, I was asked to do a welcome, and usually it involves a prayer, but I don't pray in the sense that others do. So what I do is I talk to the ancestors and ask them to give me guidance on how to proceed and how to make sure the future of our children and grandchildren are protected. These days, I feel an intense anxiety to do more. And just as we try to get rid of viruses that make our bodies sick, we are now the virus that needs to be eradicated. And it seems that Mother Earth is doing her best to get rid of us. And that comes in the way of this crazy weather and storms and corona and other viruses, heat waves and floods. Mother Earth is talking to us and we need to listen. And many know that the Indigenous ways dictate how to live our lives to make sure that 7 generations ahead have a healthy environment to sustain them. At the rate we are going now, I worry that even 3 generations ahead will have a very difficult time. So it's very important to get to the tipping point to make others aware of how destructive our way of life is. Resource extraction of all kinds is the starting point for everything pollution and climate change brings. So later my talk will focus on how communities are affected with the Mount Polleys of this world, but it is important to remember that there are many kinds of communities, and as humans, we are destroying their environments. We protect ourselves by having filtered water, air-conditioned homes, cars, and offices. In this way, we don't feel the full effect of what we are doing. We are killing many species of birds, animals, plants, and fish. They don't have the natural air conditioner they need anymore. They don't have filtered water. They are forced to live in the polluted water that humans create. And we have to remember when we talk of communities that it is not just humans we are talking about. We need to keep other communities front and center in order for us to survive. Without them, we become extinct because what they need, we need. So the most important role that I have today is being a grandmother. And so I ask the ancestors to help all of us process what we learn and help to educate others about the changes needed. Before the pandemic, our children and grandchildren were in the streets fighting for their future, and we need to help them. We have to fight for all of our grandchildren, even the grandchildren of those polluting the earth, because those grandchildren also have the right to a healthy, sustainable future, even if their ancestors don't take that into consideration. We have a lot of work to do, and I thank you for joining us today. Thanks, Nikki.
Thanks so much for that, Bev. My name is Nikki Skuse, and I'm with the Northern Confluence Initiative based here in Smithers, British Columbia on Wet'suwet'en territory. We appreciate this opportunity to have a number of industry, government, NGO, community, Indigenous, and other representatives joining us to look into best practices for mine waste storage and to also take a bit of a deeper dive into how BC measures up in comparison and some reforms that community groups and First Nations are asking for. So for the next hour, we'll hear 6 presentations, and then we'll have a question and answer period following for about the last 20 minutes to half an hour. So for those attending, please, I'm sure most people are familiar with Zoom, but there's a Q&A button there at the bottom, and we encourage you to ask questions as the presentations are going, and we'll be collating those and hopefully getting to as many as possible for a discussion towards the end. So without further ado, we'll start off by hearing from Bev Sellers again. She was the chief of the Hutzel Band at the time of the Mount Polley disaster. She's also the former chair of the First Nations Women Advocating for Responsible Mining and an advisor to the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, as well as an award-winning author. whose books you should all read. So we'll pass it on to you, Bev.
Thanks. I think, it's important. I mean, we could get into mining right away and the Mount Polleys of the world, but I think it's important to understand how we got to this point and how it has affected our communities. First of all, before the newcomers came to this land, the Indigenous peoples lived by the natural laws of the land. Indigenous peoples groomed the lands and waters so that they could continue to harvest the vast richness that Mother Earth offered. The Indigenous economy walked and grew on the land and swam in the waters. Our ancestors were healthy because they lived in harmony with nature. The view the Indigenous people had was demonstrated to me years ago from an elder. And he said that everything inside a circle, everything is connected, and humans are equal to everything living, even the rocks. So you don't have a prominent place, you're equal to everything. And that differs from the opposing way of looking at things where there's a triangle and humans are at the top and are dominant over everything else. And that way of thinking has gotten us into the mess we're in today. I always like to quote Joe Martin from the Tleoquiet tribe, and he says, "Mother Earth will provide for your needs, but not your greed." So in the area of where Mount Polley is, around Quesnel Lake and Horsefly, there are traditional pit houses everywhere. In the middle of Quesnel Lake is Caribou Island, and it is full of pit houses. Our people lived in the entire area of the Secwepemc Nation, for Secwepemc territory, for thousands of years. We have everything from inland rainforests, deserts, and everything in between to provide us with all of our needs. So at one time, our community of Hatzult was supposed to get an Indian reserve at Quesnel Lake, but I won't get into that now. The point is that even though racist laws were imposed by the newcomers to keep us from our territories, Indigenous people never ceded our lands to anyone. Unfortunately, millions of our people died off from the diseases brought by the newcomers, and that weakened our fight for our way of life. In 2007, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was adopted. And it amazes me that we had to fight for this to have it adopted. To me, it is no different than Black people having to fight for the right to be free. Now that may seem harsh, but if you read through UNDRIP, the UNDRIP document, the right in there are basic human rights for any group and only require common sense. So in the early 1970s, the Indigenous people along the Fraser River saw changes in the salmon that concerned us. And we tried to warn the Department of Fisheries and Oceans about the changes, but they said it was normal. Indigenous people have depended upon their intimate knowledge of the environment for thousands of years, and we knew it wasn't normal. And I often wonder whether if they'd listened to us, if we would be in the situation we're in today. BC and Canada had the perfect opportunity to change ancient mining laws in 2014 when the Mount Polley disaster happened. And I won't get into the technical details of the disaster. There are more qualified speakers that you'll hear from today. What I want to concentrate on is where the disaster has left our communities. I don't mean just the Indigenous communities, but communities such as the Quesnel Lake residents and everyone who relies on the Fraser River watershed. It includes communities on the ocean where salmon from the interior visit for a few years before going home to spawn. Never has a phrase, "We are all in this together," fit so perfectly. Everything is connected. The Fraser River watershed is being used as a garbage dump for industry. The cumulative effect comes into play. Every natural law is being broken, and the evidence is overwhelming and everywhere. Those who harvest from the waters and the lands are seeing, along with the changes in fish quality and quantity, we're seeing changes in wildlife, evidence of liver and organ damage in wildlife. Moose populations are way down. Birds are disappearing. The changes in Quesnel Lake that only started with the disaster, and again they claim, oh, it's climate change, not from the mine. But, you know, it doesn't take a science degree to know that these are not normal. So now many people have ceased processing fish from the Fraser River. I personally have not eaten fish from there for probably about 20 years. The cancer rates are going up and many are looking suspiciously to the salmon and the wildlife as possible causes. And for what? So people can collect so-called precious metals like gold and save it for future security. Common sense goes out the window when money is involved. People hoarding gold, diamonds, or whatever to survive in times of need are in reality helping to destroy the very economy, the real economy that they're going to need to survive, and that's food and clean water. I'm not going to get into the details of UNDRIP because I only have 10 minutes. I just want to focus on something that is mentioned a number of times in the document, and that is called free, prior, and informed consent, or FPIC, that is, as it is commonly known. FPIC is a principle protected by international human rights standards that state all peoples have the right to self-determination. And linked to the right to self-determination, all peoples have the right to freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. FPIC is backed by some of the most powerful and comprehensive international instruments that recognize the plights of Indigenous peoples, and the instruments defend our rights. The most important component of that is clean water and land. Canada and BC have adopted UNDRIP, and in doing so, agreed to FPIC, and yet, as Indigenous peoples, we are still fighting to protect our waters and lands. In addition, governments are ignoring their own laws. In the many Supreme Court of Canada decisions, Indigenous people have won. But thankfully, many people are realizing the importance of the way of life of Indigenous people and are supporting us. I believe everyone should be pushing for the immediate implementation of UNDRIP to protect themselves, no matter what nationality you belong to. Resource extraction companies use smoke and mirrors to justify their destruction of the environment. Their claims are that they provide jobs, but they don't mention that they're short-term jobs. They remind people that all the materials used in phones or other gadgets are mined, but convenience is our downfall. They claim to provide stimulus to the economy, but they fail to mention that once a mine is in existence, it will be there forever. Many still destroying the real economy, the water and land, all of the chemicals leaking still forever. Many people are unaware of the damages to the environment because they live in cities or towns far from the resource extraction activity and get everything they need from the stores. As long as it is on the shelves, they don't worry about what it takes to get there. Out of sight, out of mind, just as Indian reserves and Indigenous people were at one time. And it's been said many times that up to 90% of gold is used for jewelry. So for the vanity of humans, we are destroying the earth. In this time of examining human injustices, we have to include the environment and the way racism plays a role there. There has to be a major shakeup of the way things are done. Not only do we need to look at the human rights movement, but also the atrocities committed against the environment. Shortcuts to resource extraction need to be eliminated, and the Toronto Stock Exchange should not dictate when mining is done. I firmly believe that we are being slowly killed by resource extraction, and by not saying anything or helping to change things, we are committing slow suicide. Mount Polley and other resource extraction companies need to be held to a very high standard. Otherwise, the message to all others who are polluting is full speed ahead. There's a lot more I'd like to say, but as I said, I only have 10 minutes and there's other people that have a lot of important information. So I'll leave it at that for now. Thanks, Nikki.
Thanks so much, Bev, for that. Next, we'll hear from Stephen Emmerman from Malach Consulting and also from Jan Morrill from Earthworks. And they'll be presenting the guidelines for responsible mine tailings management. This was a document signed by 150 organizations and technical experts. So we'll pass it on to Stephen first. Stephen, are you there? Stephen?
I'm so sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, there you are. Thank you so much.
Okay, sorry. Okay, good morning, everybody. I am Stephen Emmerman. I'm the owner of Malach Consulting, and I'll be presenting with Jan Morrill from Earthworks, and we'll be talking about the recent publication called Safety First, Guidelines for Responsible Mine Tailings Management. This will be a layperson's guide. I understand there's many mining professionals on this webinar, which is fantastic. So I'd be very happy to answer any technical questions you have during the Q&A period. Okay, so let's begin. Okay, so first of all, what are tailings dams? To start with, mine tailings are the crushed rock particles that remain after the mineral of value has been removed. And typically, these mine tailings are permanently stored behind a dam that's constructed out of mine waste. Okay, so what can go wrong? The worst that can happen is the catastrophic failure of the tailings dam with the elimination of tens or hundreds of millions of cubic meters of toxic tailings into the environment. And these catastrophic failures have resulted in destruction of habitat, destruction of property, and loss of human lives. Okay. I had the great honor of visiting the site of the Mount Polley tailings dam disaster in the company of Indigenous leaders, and this was 4 years after the disaster had occurred. Okay, so safety first. What is this? This is an ultra-conservative document. Okay, now in the area of dam engineering, the word conservative means protective of people, property, and the environment. Someone could argue that a certain standard is too conservative, but anyway, that's what conservative means. Our approach has been to take the existing guidance documents in tailings dams and to choose the most conservative options among all of those documents. Okay, so let's see how this was put into practice. Okay, first of all, guideline 1, make safety the guiding principle in design, construction, operation, and closure. The ultimate goal of tailings management must be zero harm to people and the environment and zero tolerance for human fatalities. Guideline 2, ban new tailings facilities immediately upstream from inhabited areas. Now, this kind of legislation has been passed in Brazil and Ecuador and in China in the previous year. For example, here is the legislation from the state of Minas Gerais in Brazil. They say that you cannot build a tailings facility when there's a community downstream that could be reached by the flood of mine tailings within 30 minutes. Okay, this is a good start. We ask, can really every member of a community, elderly, disabled, small children, can they really be evacuated within 30 minutes? Well, maybe yes, maybe no. Okay. So our argument is that these minimum distances need to be defined on a case-by-case basis. If a tailings flood could reach a downstream community in 2 hours, but it would realistically take 3 hours to evacuate the entire community, the tailings facility should be regarded as a no-go. Now, in order to discuss the remaining guidelines, I need to give a little technical background for the lay people. Okay, So we have here an example of a conventional tailings storage facility in British Columbia. There's a pipe that comes from the ore processing plant that has the mine tailings and a lot of water. And out of these spigots, the tailings are hydraulically injected in the upstream direction. The smaller particles will settle close to the dam crest to form a beach. The smaller particles and a lot of water will be carried farther from the dam crest to form a settling pond. Important features here is that there's a lot of water mixed with the tailings, and the tailings are not compacted in any way. They're simply hydraulically injected. Okay, now the problem is that this kind of facility is highly susceptible to failure by liquefaction. Okay, so what does that mean? If we look at the left-hand side diagram, we see solid tailings particles are very loosely packed, but they touch each other. So the solids are supporting the load. Okay, now suppose we have a disturbance like an earthquake, blasting, even heavy rainfall. Now we move to the right-hand diagram. We have a disturbance, the solids settle, but it happens so fast that the water can't escape between the particles. So the water simply becomes pressurized and it holds the particles apart. Since the solids no longer touch each other, the whole mixture behaves like a liquid. And this liquefaction, this has been promoted by loose packing, that is a lack of compaction, and the spaces, the pores between the tailings being saturated with water. Okay? Now, very, very influential analysis by the expert panel on the Mount Polley disaster. That expert panel report stated 3 requirements for the current best available technology. 1, eliminate surface water from the impoundment. 2, promote unsaturated conditions in the tailings with drainage provisions. And 3, achieve dilettante conditions. Now, dilettante conditions means that the mass of tailings is so dense that when you disturb it, it will expand and not contract. Okay, that is, you can't liquefy because it's already dense. Okay, so to achieve these dilettante conditions throughout the tailings deposit by compaction of the tailings. Okay, again, according to that report, filter tailings technology embodies all 3 best available technology components. In filtered tailings, the tailings have less than 25% water content. They don't behave like a slurry, but more like a wet soil. And the good thing about the lower water content is the tailings can be compacted inside the tailings storage facility. Okay, one last technical interlude. What's called the upstream construction method for tailings dams. Okay, now these kinds of dams are inexpensive because they use a minimum amount of construction material. Basically what they do, is you construct the dam on top of the soft uncompacted tailings. It means that these kinds of dams are very susceptible to failure by liquefaction because the soft tailings can liquefy and the dam simply falls down and backwards into the liquefied tailings. Tailings dams at the recent disasters, Mount Polley, Samarco, Brumagino, those were all upstream dams. Mount Polley Dam was supposed to be a centerline dam. It was converted to an upstream dam in violation of permits. I'll say more about this later. Currently, upstream dams are prohibited in 4 Latin American countries. This will lead to Guideline 3, that is, ban upstream dams and new facilities and close existing upstream facilities. Based on what I just said, this would seem to be a no-brainer. There is another point of view, and that is that upstream dams can be constructed safely if you have ideal conditions, that is low precipitation, low seismicity, and if your team doesn't make any mistakes. Okay, this classic paper talked about 10 commandments for upstream dams and said you can't violate a single one of those commandments. Now, the modern practice in high-risk industries, that is aviation, pipelines, etc., is to not have a list of commandments that cannot be violated, but to use multiple backups, multiple redundancies, essentially make systems idiot-proof. And based on this modern practice, the time for upstream dams has passed. Okay, Guideline 4. Any potential loss of life is an extreme event and design must respond accordingly. Okay? We say that if there's potential loss of life in the event of dam failure, the dam should be designed to withstand the probable maximum flood and the maximum credible earthquake. Okay? These are the most extreme events for flooding or earthquakes that are even theoretically possible at a given location. And in this respect, we are following the guidelines for dam safety from Federal Emergency Management Agency. Okay, guideline 5. Mandate the use of best available technology for tailings, in particular filter tailings. Okay, now there is a practice of using a water cover, as we see in this diagram, to prevent acid mine drainage, and we are saying that can no longer be regarded as a best practice. Same thing was said in the Mount Polley report. It can quickly be recognized that water covers run counter to the best available technology principles. The Mount Polley failure shows why physical stability must remain foremost and cannot be compromised. Guideline 6, implement rigorous controls for safety. If there's potential loss of life in the event of dam failure, the annual probability of failure should be less than 0.001%. Otherwise, the absolute minimum annual probability of failure should be 0.01%. And in this respect, we are following recommendations of Federal Emergency Management Agency and U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Okay, further requirements on the slope of the outer embankment. We are following recommendations of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in saying that embankments should be no steeper than 1 meter vertical for 5 meters horizontal. Just for an alarming counterexample, this is a photo I took of a tailings dam under construction in Ecuador that's being constructed at a 45-degree angle, which is usually regarded as the point of collapse. Okay, guideline 7. Evaluate and characterize the dam foundation and the tailings and estimate their relationship to risk. Okay, so we are arguing that acid mine drainage has such a large potential for vast environmental damage that if the tailings have significant potential for acid generation, again, the tailings dam should be designed to withstand the probable maximum flood and the maximum credible earthquake. That is, failure of the tailings dam should be essentially impossible. Okay, guideline 8. Appropriate monitoring systems must be in place to identify and mitigate risk. Now, important part of this is that almost all mining projects, really almost all large-scale engineering projects, rely upon what's called the observational method. Okay, this says that all actions cannot be planned in advance, but as the project proceeds, observations will be made, and then choices will be made from a set of pre-planned actions or contingency plans. And the emphasis here is pre-planned actions. This was abused at the Mount Polley mine. There was a shortage of waste rock for dam construction, and the construction method was switched from centerline to upstream, and the outer embankment was steepened from 1 vertical to 2 horizontal to 1 vertical to 1.4 horizontal. And this was simply as a way of saving construction material. Okay, Mount Polley report, the observational method is useless without a way to respond to the observations. Our version, the observational method is not simply a license to figure things out later. Okay, guideline 9, ensure the independence of reviewers to promote safety. The Mount Polley report did not initiate the idea of independent tailings review boards. They certainly promoted this idea. We are emphasizing the need for true independence of tailings reviewers. Okay, and guideline 7, towards zero failure after mine closure. Okay, now after the cessation of a mining project, the tailings facility should still be reviewed, inspected, monitored, and maintained until that facility has reached a state of safe closure. Until the facility is in a state of safe closure, the mining company cannot walk away from the tailings facility. Now, we define a state of safe closure as ability to withstand without failure the probable maximum flood and the maximum credible earthquake with the ability to remain in that state indefinitely with no further inspection, monitoring, or maintenance. That is, you don't walk away from the tailings facility until failure has become essentially impossible, even without further supervision. And in this respect, we are following guidelines from Australian National Commission on Large Dams. And with that, I will turn it over to Jan.
Thank you, Stephen. So Stephen just walked us through the guidelines in the Safety First document that were closely related to risk and safety, and I am going to cover the guidelines that are more closely related to respect for affected communities and corporate accountability. So starting with guideline 11, we require that all communities, both affected communities and potentially affected communities, provide consent for every stage of the tailings facility. This consent must be free of manipulation, coercion, and extortion, and it must be carried out in a linguistically and culturally appropriate manner. This consent could also include no-go zones that are defined by Indigenous peoples or affected communities. And so the guidelines acknowledge that there may be certain areas where a tailings facility or tailings dam should never be built, no matter how the dam is designed, monitored, or operated. The guidelines also highlight that for Indigenous peoples, international law recognizes that FPIC must be in place. And thank you to Bev for the context that she provided to us at the beginning of the webinar on this topic. Next slide, please. Guideline number 12 in the Safety First document covers grievance procedures and whistleblower protections. So the Safety First guidelines say that grievance procedures must be available to employees, contractors, suppliers, regulators, as well as Indigenous groups and rights holders. So that would include affected community members. And we drew from the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, Principle 31, for how those procedures should be structured and carried out. We also require in our guidelines that the grievance procedures be administered through an independent mechanism that is not embedded in the mining company itself. We also require whistleblower protections are available not only to workers, but vendors and contractors and auditors. And we drew from Brazilian mining law and included that mine workers must be allowed to stop their tasks on the mining site at any time if they identify safety risks. And that must be able to happen without punishment. Next slide, please. Guideline 13 looks at emergency preparedness and response. So we drew for this guideline from UN guidance on preparedness for emergencies at local levels. And our guidelines require that emergency preparedness and response plans be developed and prepared together with downstream communities as well as mine workers, and in collaboration with first responders and government agencies. These plans must also include modeling and drills for worst case failure scenarios. And a worst case failure scenario is a situation where 100% of the tailings are released from the storage facility during a failure or a catastrophic event. And an example of that would be the Church Rock uranium tailings spill in New Mexico. It happened at that site. In the case of a catastrophic failure of a tailings dam, the mining company must be responsible for taking all necessary steps to save human lives and protect communities and provide appropriate aid. And they must also provide resources to local governments to make sure that they are able to save communities and protect lives as well. And then guideline 14 states that any information regarding mine safety must be made publicly available at no charge as soon as possible in the languages necessary for people to be able to access it. And this should include raw data as part of environmental monitoring, not just a summary of the final outcome. Next slide, please. And then finally, we have two guidelines related to corporate accountability. The first guideline addresses financial risk. So the Safety First document says that mining companies must have financial assurance to cover the full cost of closure and post-closure for all new and existing mines. This financial assurance must be liquid, reliable, and independently guaranteed, and it must be in place during the permitting process and the financial assurance should transfer with the sale of the mine or the tailings facility to another company or operator. The guidelines also require mining companies to have public liability insurance that will cover the economic, social, and environmental damages from either acute or chronic failures at the tailings dams. So slow releases over time or sudden catastrophic failures. The Safety First guidelines say that companies should not use corporate guarantees or be allowed to self-bond or self-insure. And then finally, we drew from the Mount Polley expert panel and said in the Safety First guidelines that safety risks are not separate from financial risks. It is important that mining companies are able to purchase and use the safest technologies, and they need to demonstrate that they've considered all the technical, environmental, social, and economic risks associated with that site. And then to finish up, the last guideline is guideline 16, says the ultimate responsibility for tailings facilities should rest with the board of directors. And because the board of directors is the entity charged with overseeing the entire mining operations, they should be held responsible in the case of tailings failures or tailings accidents. So with that, I will wrap up our presentation on the Safety First guidelines. Steve and I will be happy to answer questions in the Q&A at the end. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Stephen and Jan, for that overview. And now, just a reminder, if folks aren't used to the webinar format versus meetings, there is that Q&A button down below if you have questions that come up, and quick answers will be responded to by some folks helping out, and otherwise we'll get to those in the discussion. So next, I'd like to introduce Dr. David Chambers. He's the founder and president of the Center for Science and Public Participation, as well as an engineering and geoscience background, and has helped co-author the guidelines that we just heard about. And he's also dug deeper a little bit into how BC measures up to those, and how far we've come with those Mount Polley expert recommendations. So pass it over to you, Dave.
Thank you, Nikki. So I was asked to look at how the Safety First recommendations are or are not met by existing regulatory structure in British Columbia. I would like to focus on those guidelines that BC does not address, just because that's probably where the most important need for change lies. But time permitting, I would like to talk about those BC guidance regulations that partially meet or even fully meet the Safety First guidelines. Regulation of mining in BC basically follows three components, three guidelines. First is the BC Mines Act, which is legislative guidance. Out of that Mines Act comes the regulatory code, which are the regulations themselves. And then in order to implement those regulations or code, there's also a guidance document. So that body forms the written background upon which BC regulates mines. So now looking at the guidelines themselves, and starting with those guidelines that I don't believe are being met at all. The first guideline is make safety the guiding principle in design, construction, and operation and closure. BC does place a strong emphasis on physical stability in its guidance, but it doesn't carry this through to the risk assessment process, which is where tailings dams are essentially classified. In the risk assessment process, safety is only one of several factors to be considered. And it's therefore assumed that engineers and risk assessors will automatically make safety first. I think we've seen that in practice, if you put safety on a co-equal level with cost, for instance, which is another one of the considerations, cost will generally dominate the decision making. Guidelines 2 and 3 were ban new tailings facilities immediately upstream from inhabited areas and ban upstream dams. BC does not address either one of these issues. Guideline number 7, meaningful engagement, participation, and consent of all affected communities must be obtained for any tailings facility. BC guidance does require consultation, but it doesn't specify how this consultation is to take place. This leaves a lot of room for interpretation. And in addition, it's important to note that consultation is not consent. So I think there's a lot to be done yet in order to meet the guideline. Guideline number 12 was to develop independent grievance procedures and whistleblower protection. The Mines Act does address employee right to refuse work, but that's focused on worker safety and prohibiting discrimination. The Mines Act doesn't really address grievance procedures or whistleblower procedures. Guideline 14, information regarding mine safety must be made publicly available. BC is required to make annual dam inspection reports available, but it's not clear that other safety reports or safety data are similarly available to the public. Guideline 15, which is operating companies must have the necessary financial assurance to cover the full cost of closure and post-closure plans. BC does require a financial surety for reclamation. However, the amount of that security is left to the discretion of the chief inspector. And this has led to a very significant level of underbonding or underprotecting in British Columbia. The other part of that recommendation, guideline 15, was that operating companies must have public liability insurance to cover tailings dam failures. There's no requirement in British Columbia for accident liability insurance. And in fact, this requirement does not exist or is not enforced anywhere else in the world. So although BC doesn't do it, they're not alone in that regard. Guideline 15 was accountability resting with the board of directors. BC has no specific requirement with regard to boards of directors. BC does state in its guidance that it tries to follow the recommendations of the Mining Association of Canada. However, MAC guidance requires the designation of an accountable executive, but it only specifies that the role and accountability of the board of directors or governance level versus the accountable executive officer is to be determined by the owner and should be documented. So that's a very loose requirement. This essentially means that accountability is left with this accountable executive, while the board of directors retains the authority for spending on dam safety. And I would argue that anytime you separate accountability and authority, that often leads to problems. I want to touch on just 2 of the guidelines that I believe are partially met by BC. One of those is guideline number 4, which said that tailings dam failure potential loss of life requires a dam to be designated to withstand the most extreme meteorological and seismic events, that is, the maximum credible earthquake and the maximum probable flood. BC in its dam designations follows the 2013 Canadian Dam Association classifications, and there are 5 levels there: extreme, very high, high, significant, and low. BC requires only those extreme events be used in the design of dams that are classified as extreme. And other dam classifications from very high down to low do not have to be engineered for those maximum events. But it's important to recognize that in, for instance, the very high category, you could have up to 100 potential fatalities associated with a failure. And yet that particular dam would not necessarily require design for maximum events, which is why the Safety First guidelines said any human fatality should be associated with maximum design event. I think it's also important when we look at recommendations that come out of these technical organizations like the Canadian Dam Association or the Mining Association of Canada. Those are recommendations that are essentially being made by engineers, and they're just recommendations. There's no hard and fast or black and white technical or data requirement that drives those. And I would argue that those classifications really should come from another source, you know, a source like the government or like the Safety First, because those recommendations come from the affected parties as opposed to the technical designers. The other guideline that's partially met that I'd like to touch on is number 9, to ensure independence of reviewers to promote safety. Independent tailings review boards must be approved by the Chief Inspector of Mines in BC, but independent isn't defined by BC code or in the guidance document. So the interpretation of this, of who is independent, is left entirely to the discretion of the Chief Inspector. I think we really do need a definition of independent to guide the Chief Inspector. Otherwise, it's just totally left to that person's discretion as to what independent means. So I think I'll stop there. Again, I'm willing to discuss any of the recommendations and how their application fits in BC, but that gives you a bit of a flavor of major points. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Dr. David Chambers. Next, we're gonna hear from Alan Adzurza. Alan is currently leading mining reform discussions with the government of British Columbia on behalf of the First Nations Energy and Mining Council. He's also Taltan and an artist. I'm not sure if any of those pieces behind you are your own works, Alan, but so we'll pass it on to Alan.
So thank you, Nikki. I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me to participate, and it's an honor to do so. As Vicky says, I'm Taltan, but I wanted to let you know that I am Tlogodana. It's a wolf clan of the Taltan Nation. Nikki asked me to talk about mining reform priorities for the First Nation Energy and Mining Council. So that's kind of where I'm going to go with my presentation. I'd like to start by saying that I worked at the Faro mine in Yukon for 8 years. I worked in the mill, I worked in the open pit, and so I think I have a pretty good understanding of the mining process. I'm currently working with another group to restore placer mine sites in the Klondike goldfields in an effort to restore salmon habitat, spawning habitat in the Dawson City area. As Nikki points out, I am leading the mining reform discussions with the province on behalf of the BC First Nations Energy and Mining Council. The Energy and Mining Council is a mandated provincial not-for-profit organization that advocates and facilitates on behalf of First Nations as they strive to manage and develop energy and mineral resources in a way that protect and sustain the environment forever while enhancing social, cultural, and economic well-being of our people in BC. The Energy and Mining Council reports to the First Nation Leadership Council and is accountable to the BC Chiefs in Assembly. BC First Nations have inherent rights and title, which have been confirmed in the Supreme Court of Canada on many occasions. Simply put, we have ownership and authority over our lands and resources. We are a government. We are not a stakeholder. The courts have stressed that at a minimum, First Nations must be consulted and accommodated where projects go ahead. The UN Declaration says the minimum standard is free, prior, informed consent for projects to proceed. Simply talking to us without receiving our consent to proceed will inevitably lead to more court decisions against resource projects of all kinds. And we are witnessing this today with the proposed Trans Mountain Pipeline and LNG pipeline projects. In 2012, the Ross River Dena Council went to court and received a court decision that states that Crown constitutional duties of consultation and accommodation must occur before Crown mineral claims are issued, and consultation and potentially compensation must take place before issuing approvals for exploration work. I'd like to point out that because of that decision, the Casca lands in Yukon are currently under a moratorium and no staking is allowed. Simply talking to us about consultation today is not adequate. Everything now requires, in our view, consent. In 2019, the province of BC, in their throne speech, committed to true and lasting reconciliation with Indigenous people, including making sure they are full participants in decision-making that affect their rights and lands. In November of 2019, the province proclaimed the Declaration Act. This act was co-developed with First Nation Leadership Council and other Indigenous organizations. I'd like to echo Bev's comments that this is a piece of human rights legislation. I recently made a comment to a friend of mine that public government in Canada is losing public confidence. And I was asked, why do you think that? This is an important question. I responded, the analysis by the First Nation Energy and Mining Council of 35 tailings dams finding concluded that BC First Nations communities are on the front line of mining negative environmental impacts, including disasters, polluted rivers, toxic waste sites, and degraded land and air quality. And potentially 33 First Nation communities, along with 8,000 kilometers of streams, rivers, and lakes, and an additional 208 communities and settlements could be directly impacted, some of those in the US, in the United States. There are many public reports that highlight issues and concerns, such as Sparwood Town needed to be temporarily town wells needed to be temporarily shut down due to high selenium contamination. That the Elk Valley fish population was being affected by selenium contamination. That the Chief Inspector of Mines report concluded that financial security deposits for restoration of mine sites were undersecured by more than $1.2 billion. Canada taxpayers are on the hook since there is no means to hold the polluter accountable. That Red Chris mine is the same tailing design as Mount Polley, but 3 times bigger, with potential to do much more environmental damage than Mount Polley if there is a breach. The Tulsiquat Cheap mine that went bankrupt has been leaching environmental contaminations for over 60 years. That the federal government recently approved $2 billion to begin addressing mine restoration of historical projects approved under their jurisdiction several years ago, such as the Faro Mine, the Quetzal Mine, and the Giant Yellowknife Mine in the NWT. It is critically important for the general public to become more aware and to begin to hold their public representatives accountable. As Bev said, we are committing suicide by being silent. I participated in a dialogue with the Natural Resource Canada initiative regarding the updating of the Canadian Mines and Metals Plan last year. And information provided to the participants included charts that demonstrates Canada is falling in the ratings for countries for preference for mining. So where are we at? The 2014 Mount Polley disaster opened up a dialogue between First Nations leadership and the BC government on mining law and mining reform. Mining dialogue that we've undertaken involves primarily our first priority is the Mineral Tenure Act. This act is a non-discretionary system that needs to be replaced with a discretionary system. We need to implement First Nations free prior informed consent prior to granting legal interest in lands and resources. We need to talk about the establishment of standards for mining, such as IRMA. We need to talk about the establishment of non-refundable hard financial assurances, such as cash, bonds, insurance, etc., be put in place within the first 3 years of mining operations. We need consideration for independent monitor compliance enforcement consistent with the 2016 Auditor General Report due to regulatory capture. Need to consider incorporating a process to ensure First Nation guardians have a role in the monitor compliance enforcement function. We need to emphasize the need to clean up existing contaminated sites, especially those that are under government's care and maintenance due to corporations going bankrupt without proper closure. We need to talk about the establishment of a super fund for future catastrophes, such as Mount Polley. The mining placer sector needs to be a regulated industry. Currently, we view it as not being regulated, and the larger projects need to go through an environmental assessment process like any other mining activity. Cumulative impacts needs to be considered, and we need to remove the exemptions that have been put in place. We are talking about minerals on reserve, the mining code, and environmental assessment. The environmental assessment for sure can play a role in First Nations leading those assessments. All of these activities are a serious threat to our salmon. The wild salmon are an important part of our culture and livelihood and BC, and they are threatened by mining projects. Wild salmon stocks are under serious threat on BC coast, in part due to sea-based farm climate change, overfishing, and impact to spawning habitats. The slide at Big Bar demonstrates how migrations will be impacted for several years to come. In concluding my remarks, I would like to focus on the pending Mines Amendment Act, known as Bill 6. This act was unilaterally drafted and introduced by the Minister of Mines. It is not consistent with the Declaration Act. Bill 6 fails to address the Ministry of Energy and Mines' conflicting dual role as a promoter of exploration and mining on one hand and as a regulator on the other. First Nations guardians in monitoring, compliance, enforcement could serve as a showpiece for the Declaration Act. These legislative amendments, such as Bill 6 during a global pandemic, being unilaterally done by the government, is not honorable, especially since most First Nation offices were closed during the pandemic. With that, I'd like to thank you for listening. Adu.
Thank you so much, Alan, for sharing that. The last speaker that we're going to hear from is Deborah Curran. She's the Executive Director of the Environmental Law Center at the University of Victoria, as well as an associate professor there who focuses a lot on watershed and municipal law. So we'll pass it over to you, and I'll just share my screen.
Great, thanks very much, Nikki, and hello everyone. I'm speaking to you from Wasanich Territory on the southeast coast of Vancouver Island. For those of you who don't know, the Environmental Law Center is the oldest public interest environmental law clinic in Canada, and the purpose is to train the next generation of public interest environmental lawyers in Canada and to provide legal capacity to community organizations and First Nations in BC. And to that end, we provide about 4,000 hours of pro bono legal services each year. And if you are involved with an organization and would like some assistance on a legal issue, please do approach us for some assistance. Our work on mining has really spanned the entire time that we've been in existence, but we noticed over the last decade that we were increasingly almost every term doing one or two projects on mining, and each of them were always entirely discrete. So one would be, for example, working with Bev and making submissions to the expert review panel after the Mount Polley mine disaster. And then a few years later, supporting the lawyer who laid the charges under provincial law in her name against the company. We've also supported the Chilcotin National Government's lawyers several times in opposing the Prosperity Mine and the destruction of Fish Lake as a tailings pond, and also crafted submissions in opposition to the Ajax mine based on water quality issues. So we get organizations from across BC coming to us for assistance, but there's no cohesion or coming together to look at this from a systemic perspective. So we've long been aware that mining is sort of the last untouched legal regime dealing with the environment. And in many ways, we're still in the 1800s with our regulatory design. And because of this, continually working on discrete projects, we really saw the need to pull it all together into a comprehensive look at mining and the law reforms that were needed. So from 2018 to 2020, we partnered with MiningWatch Canada and Fair Mining Collaborative with the support of First Nations women advocating for responsible mining and Northern Confluence. And we did a multi-year project on creating this mining law reform platform, which is what you can see up on your screen right now. And so if you go to reformbcmining.ca, you can find these, I think they're called the reports, but these are the elements of comprehensive mining law reform for British Columbia. And this project really had two parts of it. The first was the platform, and then the second was to create or to coalesce the BC Mining Law Reform Network. So in terms of the platform, what you'll see in front of you are the 8 shorter platforms that have 69 recommendations for reforming BC mining. And it's really intended to be the comprehensive long game for mining law reform and to be systemic. So it's not opposing one waste permit application or a new mine but it's really intended to be read as sort of a full platform for how we explore for, site, operate, and close or reclaim mining extraction in British Columbia. So I draw your attention to two platforms specifically. One is on Indigenous governance in mining, which explores the conditions necessary for prior and informed consent. And the other one is on waste disposal and management. And in the waste disposal and management platform, there are 8 recommendations, which I'll just quickly read to you. They mirror in some way what's been discussed, and it'll be interesting to go back to them in light of the new guidelines, safety first guidelines, and to see whether they match up. So the first is to establish a comprehensive plan to safely retire at least 60 active mine tailings dams as recommended by the government's expert panel. Number 2, prohibit wet tailings impoundment unless it can be demonstrated through a risk assessment process that wet tailings impoundment poses less long-term risk. And when we talk about risk, it's environmental, financial, and public safety risk than a dry tailings approach. Recommendation 3 is where wet tailings impoundments are in use, require dry closures, such as draining, when mining operations cease, unless it can be demonstrated through a risk assessment process that long-term maintenance of a wet tailings impoundment poses less risk. Recommendation 4 is to ensure that public safety, environmental safety, and economic safety are the determining factors in governing what tailings disposal systems are implemented. Number 5, require that financial feasibility studies conducted for proposed mines and waste disposal systems take into account the full long-term life cycle costs of facilities and include externalities such as long-term costs and risks to the environment, industry, taxpayers, and public safety. Number 6, require and apply the strictest and most rigorous standards when tailings dams are unavoidable. Number 7, require that all mines in BC comply with the IRMA standards or better for waste and materials management. And finally, number 8, prohibit disposal of mine wastes into rivers, lakes, and oceans. So this platform is really a broad consensus of a wide variety of organizations and individuals who reviewed these, provided comments, so mining law experts as well as mining engineers themselves, which you can see. So Nikki will navigate to the page of the supporters, and the supporters of this include the First Nations Energy and Mining Council and Salmon Beyond Borders, so the organizers and participants in today's webinar. The second aspect of our project was to coalesce the BC Mining Law Reform Network. And so this is over 20 organizations in BC who are working on mining. And the intent is to support one another and lend our collective and strategic expertise to issues occurring across the province related to mining. So if you're in that category and have not yet joined the network, please do join off of the reformbcmining.ca website. And in that way, we are hoping to push forward on a more systemic approach to mining law reform and addressing mining issues in British Columbia. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Deborah, for that. So I'm going to get all of the speakers to put your videos on so that we can see you all in gallery view, and we'll get to some of the questions. There's been some excellent questions that have been posed to date. I think to start with, when Alan was talking, there was, he referenced Bill 6, and which is a few both sort of housekeeping changes that are being made to the Mines Act, but also is supposed to be addressing the independence unit. And one of the MLAs referenced the aviation industry, but from what I know, when the aviation industry has a crash, rules and regulations change almost immediately, or even entire fleets are grounded to improve safety. And I know that, you know, Mount Polley, Brumadinho, Samarco, you know, other major tailings disasters seem to be the impetus behind the soon to be released global tailings standard. And yet, you know, change in this sector seems to be really slow. to improve safety. And, you know, Dave, you pointed out as well as Stephen that, you know, BC is supposed to be having our current inventory, and yet there's no action plan there or adopting best available technology. So I'm just wondering if anyone would like to comment or share your thoughts on that, or even on the upcoming global tailings standard about to be released next week.
I don't mind commenting on the upcoming global industry standard on tailings management. Of course, I haven't seen the standard because it's not being released until next week, not until August 5th. I did study the draft very carefully, and I made comments on the draft, and of course, many people did. So I don't mind saying a bit about how our document is or is not similar to the global industry standard. If I could start off with the very first sentence in the preamble of the draft of the Global Tailings Standard. This standard strives toward the ultimate goal of zero harm to people and the environment and zero tolerance for human fatality, which is exactly what we say. Okay, so we're starting from the same starting point, which is excellent. Okay, the question is, where do we go from there, and how serious are we about this requirement? Our aim in writing this document was to take existing guidance documents and in essentially all circumstances choose the most conservative, that is the most protective of all of those documents. When I read the draft of the Global Tailings Standard, I mostly had the impression that they took existing guidance documents and asked what did they all have in common. That is, what was the least common denominator? Not 100%, but more or less, okay? And it wasn't clear from there exactly how is that a way to move forward by just asking what are our minimum areas of agreement. And I also was disappointed, at least in the draft, that there was so little mention of actually requirements for engineering and construction. And to say the most important things that come to mind right now is the draft of the Global Tailings Standard did not set minimum requirements for distances between dams and downstream communities. It did not call for an end to the construction of upstream dams. It did not call for a transition from wet tailings to filter tailings. So in that way, I see our document as being much more protective of people and the environment.
Great, thanks, Stephen. And Jan, I don't know if you also want to comment. There's been a couple of questions about what you see as the sort of vision or use of these guidelines, and could it be an organizational or community tool somehow?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for those questions. I think you all are thinking along the lines that we are. So I think the way that we're looking at this document for now is getting these guidelines out and understood, and sharing information so that everyone has access to them. And then there will be kind of a phase 2 in which we are hoping to engage with communities and understand how these guidelines can be useful on a local level. And Alan, I appreciated in your presentation, you talked about holding public representatives accountable. And we're hoping that these guidelines can be used to help hold public representatives accountable. One interesting example from the release of the guidelines is that organizations in Spain that have been organizing around new and abandoned tailings facilities put the guidelines out, and they were picked up by a local political party that was running for regional elections in Spain and incorporated into their platform. So we hope that these guidelines can be useful and applicable in many ways, and we want to continue to work with communities to adapt them to fit everyone's needs, or the needs the best we can. Thanks.
Great, thanks. And then I don't know if this is both for Bev, Alan, and Deborah maybe, but someone asked, what is the role of social license in operating a new mine?
A lot of silence. Nikki, the way I would kind of respond to that is this way, is to say that all British Columbians should be concerned about pollution of our significant waterways. These waterways, like I participated in transboundary First Nation dialogue, and we have in fact issued a declaration stating that pollution of water is a serious concern in British Columbia, and the impact to the wild Pacific salmon stocks is moving them towards an endangered species. So we have significant concerns around those. The idea that projects, as you can see, projects that move ahead, such as the LNG, such as the Trans Mountain Pipeline and the Site C Dam, are moving ahead without First Nations support that we believe is required. And as a result of that, you see a lot of social unrest and a lot of legal actions occurring. I do believe that other British Columbians feel like First Nations do. And these, but we need, there's not the same ability for them to raise it at a government to government level that First Nations are bringing it forward. But I do think we got to figure out how to get the general public voice heard in a more succinct way on trying to deal with the idea of social license.
And I might just add that the concept of social license has been something in the forefront of industry considerations since before 2000. So, you know, we're well over 20 years. But I think there's a real difference between the concept that's discussed and how social license is expressed in practice. For example, one of the projects that I've worked on for a number of years now is the Pebble Mine in Alaska. And it's very clear that the people of the region don't want that mine. And polling indicates that the majority of Alaskans in the state don't want that mine. But because of the financial power and political pressure that can be brought, that mine is still very much a potential. So I don't know that you could say that social license is being respected in that regard.
Deborah, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to invite us to think, well, I think there's very little social license in British Columbia for mining at this point in time. Yet it still carries on because there is this view that mining is a sort of foundational economic driver in our province, which, you know, we're sort of based on hewers of wood and drawers of water. But the reason it can continue is because it continues in a place where we don't see it, which impacts Indigenous communities and the environment very fundamentally. I'd love us all, though, to reorient the way we think about mining and reorient it to a demand management approach. So rather than looking for new minerals, we need to encourage our governments and the entire way that the industry is going to reclaim metals. So there's lots of metal out there, and we need to pay a whole lot more for it, and we need to also develop the industries for reusing metal rather than constantly going to new sources. And the reason we can go to new sources and why it's cheap and why then new metals go into our iPhones or our cell phones and other things, or to build large new buildings, is because the externalities are put out on the environment. So if we tighten our environmental standards globally, and also our worker safety, then the whole recycling aspect or the reclaiming aspect of minerals becomes a lot more, or metals, I mean, becomes a whole lot more viable.
Thanks, Beth.
Yeah, I agree with Deborah. I keep telling mining companies they need to go and mine in garbage dumps before they go to pristine areas. And I think, you know, the whole issue of social licenses, you know, the government supposedly looks after our interests, but they're responsible. Yeah, I mean, you know, they push mining and at the same time try to act as the watchdogs. And I think anywhere there's supposed to be a mine, I mean, look at you know, so Coteen, you know, in their territory, how long they've had to fight to keep that mine out of their territory, you know, and I think they probably, you know, that mine is probably still going to try to push something in the years to come. I don't think they've given up. But we, you know, social license is never going to exist as long as the people in the area aren't part of the decision-making process. And it always amazes me how people in Ottawa or people in Victoria can claim to know what's best for the area when they don't live there. They're not on the land, they don't see the changes. And so for me, social license is not going to exist until the people in the area, that's the Indigenous people and the other people, are a part of that decision-making process.
Great, thanks everyone. Now for, I don't know if this will be the last question we get to, but so I'm gonna chunk 3 of them together. So someone asked, you know, how long does it typically take for closed tailings facilities to be safe? And I think this is a good question too, because a lot of mines in British Columbia are under care and maintenance for years and years and years and don't really officially close. So how long does that typically take? And also if anyone has a couple of tips for effective strategies for restoration, and as well if somebody from the technical side could just address how filtered tailings protect acid mine or deal with acid mine drainage.
How about if Dave takes the closure and then I'll talk about acid mine drainage.
Closure's a tough one, you know, to judge when it's been done properly, because that always involves a degree of monitoring. And as Steve mentioned in his presentation, ideally you design a mine so that you can walk away from it and it doesn't need any maintenance and doesn't need any monitoring. But in reality, that doesn't happen. If you look at tailings dam accidents, most of those occur while the mine is operating. And there are a number of reasons for that, but fundamentally, you can look at the fact that the dam is still being built, the facility is still being built. And then once the mine closes, it's completely built, it's had a chance to stabilize, whatever. So we see fewer failures after closure. But, you know, we still don't have a good track record on these things. The industry has basically been using tailings dams for up to 100 years. And in geologic terms, which is what these facilities have to be stable for, that's nothing. So we've still got a lot to learn.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Okay, so there's a question about connection between filter tailings and acid mine drainage. Just so everyone knows what we're talking about, let me first explain acid mine drainage. So you have sulfide minerals below the surface, and when during mining, they're brought to the surface, they're crushed, they're exposed to oxygen, they will oxidize, and they will convert the sulfur in the sulfide minerals into sulfuric acid. And in many cases, this has had very far-reaching environmental damage. Okay, so one way to prevent acid mine drainage, it doesn't work completely, but one approach to that is to keep the tailings always covered with water. Okay, for example, that's the plan at the Mirador mine in Ecuador. The tailings are covered with water, and the plan is that they will be covered with water in perpetuity. Okay, now in our document Safety First, we are arguing the time for that has passed. Okay, and that also was said in the expert panel report on Mount Polley, that it is no longer acceptable to maintain surface water on top of tailings. That is simply a recipe for disaster. Okay, tailings should be filtered. That is, they should be unsaturated. They should have no water cover. Okay, that means that if you want to prevent acid mine drainage, you have to do it in another way. Okay, but keeping the tailings covered is no longer an option. Okay, how you can prevent acid mine drainage is a big topic to explain right now. Okay, if someone on the webinar wants to talk about this for a particular mine, I'm very happy to discuss that. But certainly the root cause is you minimize the production of tailings that have a high sulfur content. Okay, just to name two things, there's technology called ore sorting, where the ore is crushed into bite-sized pieces. It's examined with X-rays or other technologies to ascertain its elemental content. If it's too high in sulfur or it's too low in the mineral value, it simply is not processed at all. So you never produce the tailings that are high in sulfur. Another approach is in the mineral processing plant, to put as maximum amount of sulfur into the concentrate as possible, so that is simply shipped off site. Anyway, that's just a start, okay? It's simply a water cover prevention of acid mine drainage is no longer best available technology.
Great, thank you so much, Stephen, for that. And I think too, just on another front, in terms of the closed tailings, as Alan mentioned, you know, the idea of Indigenous guardians too, and people out monitoring the land regularly is also a key important role and recommendation. So we're coming up to the top of the hour. So I just want to thank all the speakers so much, and to everyone who attended and is concerned about tailing safety. I'd also like to thank the Environmental Law Center and Earthworks, First Nations Women Advocating for Responsible Mining, Northern Confluence, MiningWatch, Salmon Beyond Borders, and the BC Mining Law Reform Coalition for sponsoring this webinar. There is an action for those interested to call on the BC government to reduce risk to communities and watersheds by putting safety first in tailings design and management. I think Jamie shared that around on the chat. Yeah, just to close, I think, you know, we all recognize the need and urgency for a low carbon future, but, you know, it can't be done on the back of bad mining practices. And in BC, we have plenty of examples, from historical legacies like Britannia to ongoing ones like Tulsa Chief or Teck selenium leaching in the Elk River, to more recent ones like Banks Island Gold and the Mount Polley disaster, which is having its 6th anniversary date in a few days. So we not only can, but I think must do better, and to reduce the risk to watersheds and communities. So thanks everyone, and onwards.